second video I've done on Stalinist USSR. This one's a bit more detailed. Okay, so the overview is the first one you'll see from a while ago. This is a bit more detailed. So again, you have this mind map. This is for your revision. If you're going into the exam and you're asked about, you do an ordinary level, these details will be good for your knowledge of Stalinist Russia. If you're doing higher level, the question is likely to be on how Soviet Union was transformed, or how Stalin used terror with a focus on the Purges. Okay, so you've got your Purges essay that you've been given, and again, that has all those kind of little details about the various trials. This is an overview, and hopefully you'll find it useful. So we know who Nikolai Yezhov was. We're going to see his name again in a moment. He was the one of the heads of the secret police, which went through a number of name changes, but we call him the NKVD for ease. And his phrase, "When you chop wood, chips fly," is just a really, really brilliant quote to learn that offers insights into the attitudes of the Stalinist regime to the people of the Soviet Union. They didn't care about innocents being caught up in their terror. In fact, their intention was that people would be afraid that they would be caught up. So when they were going after their enemies, who they called the Trotskyites or capitalists or imperialist agents or, whatever the hell, they didn't care if innocents were hurt. So the chopping of the wood, that is the securing of the Stalinist regime. Chips flying and hitting people and harming people, that's the innocent victims. Okay? Now, so let's get going. Again, I'm going to try to keep this really short. So we know USSR came into being following the October Revolution, 1917, when Lenin led the Bolsheviks, the communists, who overthrew the Tsar. But we know by 1923-24, Lenin's extremely ill, he's dying, and he leaves this last testament. And the last testament talked about not having one leader, having a shared kind of Politburo government, but primarily the last testament said that that Lenin did not want Stalin to be in a position of power after he died. And that last testament was, of course, suppressed by Stalin following Lenin's death. And indeed, Lenin's wife, who opposed Stalin, was also suppressed. Stalin came to power through the position of General Secretary of the Communist Party. So that's very important that you know that. He didn't look for glamorous titles. He wasn't the leader of the party. He was the General Secretary, which essentially gave him power because he was responsible for appointing the Communist Party. By the mid-1920s, governed every aspect of life in the Soviet Union. So if you wanted to have a position of power, if you wanted to have something that gave you authority or influence, you needed to do it through the Communist Party. And the person who was responsible for appointing people to those jobs was Joseph Juglashvili, otherwise known as Stalin, and that gave him huge influence and huge power. After Lenin's death, he cooperated with Kamenev and Zinoviev, two old Bolsheviks, very significant figures in the October Revolution and the Civil War, to oppose Trotsky. Stalin, Kamenev, and Zinoviev formed a triumvirate. That word triumvirate means a group of three who rule, and their intention was to isolate Trotsky, each one of them thinking that they would then become the supremo. Zinoviev and Kamenev underestimated Stalin's capacity, his intelligence, his threat, and by 1929, Trotsky had been sidelined. He went into exile for fear of his life, and Stalin had control of the Politburo. It's very, very important that you try to, as a history student, try to read as much as you can. I'm always talking to you about reading books, not just relying on what you're told in class. The book that I've been talking about recently, In the Court of the Red Tsar, has really interesting things to say. Sorry, I'm just making my coffee. Has really interesting things to say about how Stalin didn't rule as a dictator, the way we think of him, until the kind of early 1930s, 33, 34. That there was a sense that he was first among equals with the Politburo. So this idea that he was just like this kind of evil I suppose he was, but I mean, this kind of, autocrat from the very beginning is not true. He was, however, the most dominant person in the party by 1929, when you can kind of say from 29, that was Stalinist Russia. It's important that you know that, like all totalitarian regimes, the Soviet state used terror and a secret police to control the populace. The Cheka and the NKVD are two of the names the the secret police went under, and the heads, you need to know the names of the heads of the NKVD. So Yagoda, he was the head up until, from the death of Dzerzhinsky in the late 20s up until 1936. Then when he was purged, he was arrested and accused of all sorts of crimes, most of which he was innocent of, but he was guilty of many, many other crimes, and he was purged. He was replaced by Yezhov, who was also known as Blackberry, and Yezhov was, I suppose, in charge during the height of the terror. So when we think about all those hundreds of thousands of people being executed, millions of people being sent away to exile in Siberia, the real horror of that period of paranoia and fear that we know as the terror in the 1930s, Yezhov was really in power of the NKVD, doing Stalin's black work, dirty work. Stalin called it black work, the execution of enemies between 1936, 37, 38. Beria replaced Yezhov. By the late 1930s, Yezhov was out of control. Stalin didn't trust him. He was sidelined, and eventually, again, he was also purged. The program for change. You have to understand that the Soviet Union, when it came into being in the 1920s, was a project. It was a Bolshevik project. And the project was intended to transform what used to be the Russian Empire into a modern industrial state. If you were to kind of sum up one thing about Stalinist Russia up until the Second World War, it's this determination to use any means necessary to modernize the country, and that meant to industrialize the country. So between the late 1920s, right all the way through the 1930s, new cities were built, new railways were laid, new canals were dug, and these were mass projects that were designed to modernize, industrialize Russia, but had a huge human cost. As I said to you in class, great to know the names of one of the cities, great to know the names of one of the projects. So Magnitogorsk, that was one of those new cities that was built from scratch in the early 1930s. I think it was 1932. Magnitogorsk was constructed, but this is an example of how they took nothing and created something, an industrial centre. The other one to think of is the White Sea Canal up there in the Baltic. This was a major prestige project to link one of the production centres of Russia with the ports up in the Baltic. There were 126,000 slave labourers on that project. There's no other word for it. There were slave labourers. There were prisoners in the Gulag, and they were forced to work on that project in horrendous conditions. And over the course of the 2 years when that project was underway, the estimates are, and they're probably low estimates, that 25,000 of those prisoners, slave labourers, were killed. The focus wasn't on the well-being of individuals, because when you chop wood, chips fly. The focus was on, furthering and creating a manufacturing base for the Soviet Union, and exploiting the natural resources which the Soviet Union was rich in, particularly oil and coal. Stalin introduced the 5-year plans. You need to know what these are. These were the programs to bring about the economic transformation, and they crossed late 20s into the 1940s. The first one's probably the most important one. It was between 1928 and 32, approximately. It was significant because it was successful, even if you take into account the human cost. And one statistic will sum up the success of the first 5-year plan. In 1928, when it began, the USSR was the 5th most industrialized nation on the earth. By 1932, 33, when it was over, it was the 2nd most industrialized nation in the world, only to the United States, which was this boom economy. So that'll show you how, and don't forget, this is during the period of the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression and the economic crash. That'll show you how much things changed in the Soviet Union. The commissar who was in charge of the first 5-year plan was called Pyatakov. Pyatakov, despite the material success of the first 5-year plan, was purged. He was arrested. He was accused of being a saboteur, of failing to meet his targets. When in the Soviet Union, when targets were set, they were usually unrealistic targets. And when targets were not met because they were unrealistic, the response was to accuse the people in charge of deliberately sabotaging, because of course the plan couldn't be wrong, because the plan came from the Politburo. Don't forget what the Politburo is. It's the ruling elite council led by Stalin of the Communist Party. So if it wasn't the plan that was the problem, it must be that there were people going out of their way to harm the Soviet Union. That was the belief. Okay. Now the second. Sorry, I'm just going to fix that. The second 5-year plan between the 1933-37, that period, again concentrated on the development of heavy industry, and this was the impetus, the incentive behind this 5-year plan obviously was still to modernise, but there was given added incentive, added impetus, added importance because of the rise of Nazi Germany. And the obvious, you read, Stalin was very, very, very intelligent. He was a really erudite man. He read a lot. All you got to do is look at Mein Kampf and you can see Hitler's plan, which was to go into the East and conquer the East. So this idea that Nazi Germany was on the rise, that had to be met by the Soviet Union. That was the message. Germany became a leading country in steel production, and the focus in the 5-year plan was on, again, manufacture of heavy goods, steel production being part of that. Something to mention in any essay on the 5-year plans or economic changes in the Soviet Union were the positives, and there were some positives despite the horrors. There were great improvements in transport. Thousands of miles of railways, for example, laid, and the integration of women into the workforce. Now, it wasn't that a woman's life was easy, but the fact is that the Soviet Union did introduce free childcare so that women could, if they chose to, go and work in the industrial factories. So that was an innovation that would have been unheard of in other countries, and it's an innovation which freed up this huge resource, women in the workforce. Another thing to remember is this idea of the Stakhanovite propaganda. So Stakhanov, was a Ukrainian miner who famously managed to come up with ways to make his the mine he worked in more efficient. His cult became a huge part of Soviet propaganda. The message was, you can be successful if you work hard like Stakhanov. If you go further, if you sacrifice, if you suffer now, if we all do that, this was the message, then we can achieve the workers' paradise. So ironically, for a movement, the communist movement, which was very much anti-religion, there was very much almost like a Christian underlying message, which is that you suffer in this life in order to be rewarded in the next. So talk about the idea in any essay of Stakhanov, talk about the idea of propaganda being used to sell this idea to the Soviet people that yes, you're suffering now, yes, you're working hard now, yes, there are shortages now, but you're doing it to make a better future. And it was very effective. It was together with the terror, of course. Third 5-year plan, late 30s into early 40s, 37 to 42 approximately, 41, 42, Barbarossa happened. The third 5-year plan, very importantly, this was where everybody could see, Stalin was no dummy, everybody could see, that war was coming, and the focus in the third 5-year plan was the production of war materiel. Okay, so tanks, aircraft, artillery, ammunition, trucks, all the things you need to prepare for an imminent European war. By the way, as I mentioned in class, very important, Stalin and his cronies did not expect or did not understand the technological transformations that had taken place in warfare. They didn't understand it. They still thought cavalry would be really important. So actually, some of the generals in the Soviet army, I'll get to this in a few minutes, who disagreed with Stalin and his approach to preparation for war, they were purged. We'll come to that in a minute. Now, besides the 5-year plans, you have to know about collectivization. So, collectivization was, it was a crime beyond my ability to understand. But essentially, Stalin and the Communist Party wanted to have absolute control of everything in the Soviet Union. One of the problems that they had in Imperial Russia and up into the 1930s was food supply issues. So they were trying to expand the cities. You had a big worker population in the cities, but there was a problem feeding them. And the belief was this was because of two reasons. Number one, traditional farming methods were inefficient and could not produce the amount of food required. And number two, that there was a subclass of enemies of the project, enemies of communism, who were deliberately sabotaging attempts to improve food supply. So this was a big issue. And the communist answer was to use terror in the countryside to force farmers to hand over their crops and their animals to the state. And farmers in many parts of the Soviet Union, particularly in the Ukraine, resisted this by doing things like burning their crops rather than allowing them to be taken for no reward, or just not harvesting the crops, leaving them withering in the fields rather than having them taken by the state, or not sowing them. And there was a period in 1933 where literally millions of cattle were slaughtered by their own owners as a protest against communists' attempts to control farming. And of course, that led to even worse widespread food shortages and eventually to a terrible famine. What was the answer of the Politburo? What was Stalin's answer? Well, obviously, whatever's going on in the country, it's not our fault. There has to be enemies within, and this caste, this social group were blamed. They were called the kulaks. Now again, you look at historically, who were the kulaks? There was no such thing as kulaks. Right? This was an invention by the Soviet propaganda machine to basically say that any farmer who resists us is a middle class, Tsarist, Trotskyite enemy of the people, and they're all kulaks. So anybody who resists our attempt to collectivize the farms, which is take ownership from the individual farmer and create this, single unit that they believe would be more efficient, that they were kulaks and they had to go. And hundreds of thousands of them were deported, and tens of thousands of them died in NKVD prisons. Collectivization, the idea of central planning of farming, it was believed that that would make farming more efficient. And anybody who resisted, as I said, was deported. Was collectivization successful? No, it wasn't. So Soviet food production after collectivization was less efficient than it was before. Might get a couple of stats and stick them in that mind map because we have numbers on that, but it was. And when in 1933, which was known as Hungry 33, when these pressures really came to bear, there was a massive famine in the Ukraine, and estimates say that up to nearly 4 million people, just in the Ukraine alone, died as a result of that essentially man-made famine. There was one other important result from collectivization. By the way, during the Second World War, in conversation with Winston Churchill, Stalin said that the war that he fought on collectivization with the kulaks, he called it with the kulaks, that determination to master the rural areas, the countryside, that was the most difficult time of his life, including the Second World War, including the first year of the Second World War when the Soviet Union was nearly wiped off the face of the earth. So that'll tell you the extent of the impact of collectivization. But by the end of it, he won. The communists broke resistance and had complete control in rural as well as urban areas. That's very, very important. Now, the terror. 34, Kirov, Stalin's pal, head of the Communist Party in Leningrad. He's shot dead in his office by a disgruntled worker. That, it is believed, was Stalin's work, but we don't have historical proof of that. But regardless of that, Kirov was assassinated, and his assassination was used as an excuse to spark the first purge. And this is where Stalin really seized power for himself. This is where Stalin, he already had power, but this is where he became obviously the dictator. And purge means to cleanse through suffering. So his idea was to use violence to wipe out anybody who might potentially be a challenger to his authority in the Communist Party. So he went after leading communists, senior Bolsheviks, people from the Lenin years. There were 3 purges. Again, this is in the other mind map that I've already done, so I won't go into this in too much detail. Andrei Wyszynski was the chief prosecutor who stood up and did his great performance, accusing the men in the dock, and often women in the dock, of being traitors and Trotskyites and imperialists and anti-capitalists anti-communists and anti-revolutionaries. And these show trials were filmed, and then they were broadcast to the people of the Soviet Union, showing the people of the Soviet Union that they were surrounded by spies, they were surrounded by traitors, and that they had to work harder to bring about the workers' paradise because of these enemies. It was all propaganda. It was all Stalin asserting his power, bringing terror to the party and to the country, and it was highly effective. Across the 1930s, estimates reckon that 2 million people died as a result of Stalin's purges. It's worth knowing the name of Blokhin. I'm nearly sure his name is Andrei Blokhin, doesn't matter. He was an NKVD executioner, and I've told you this before, who was responsible personally for the deaths of tens of thousands of people. And he was the guy who I told you in 1940 in Katyn Forest personally executed by shooting in the back of the head 7,000 members of the Polish military, aristocracy and intelligentsia in Katyn Forest. Just incredible stuff. Okay? Now, after the purge of the Communist Party, which was essentially over by 1938, Stalin turned to the Red Army. The Red Army was the term used for the Soviet military. And as I said, there was a disagreement on policy between the leading generals in the Soviet military and the leading members of the Communist Party. So Stalin looked at the generals, he saw them as a potential threat to his leadership, and he decided to purge the army. The name you learn is Marshal Tukhachevsky. He was a senior commander of the Red Army. He was highly respected and regarded as an expert in modern tactics, those tactics that very soon became famous as blitzkrieg, tanks, aircraft, rapid movement of troops to encircle enemy armies. He was arrested and purged in 1938, and he was executed along with many other generals. This was done secretly, not publicly, so these weren't show trials, because of course, if he was letting it be known that he was purging his army, he was letting it be known that his army was weak, because of course we lacked leaders, and he didn't want that known. There's that note on Blokhin. It's very important to note that there is a direct line between the Red Army's inability to cope with the German attack in 1941 with Barbarossa and the fact that Stalin had wiped out much of the leadership of the Red Army, and they were very, very lucky to survive those first few months of the war. Finally, very quickly, sometimes when they ask you about Stalin, it goes up to 1945, the question. So just have a paragraph ready on the Soviet Union during the Second World War. It was known as the Great Patriotic War in the Soviet Union. Their involvement began, don't forget, the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact in August 1939, which was the green light for Hitler to invade Poland without having to worry about the Soviet Union. Stalin thought he could trust Hitler. He was wrong. In 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the Germans launched 3 armies. I think it was 3 million men. Into the Soviet Union, intending to knock the Soviet Union. I think Hitler said it would be like kicking in a rotten door. I think that's the quote. He thought it was going to be easy, and it looked like it was going to be easy at the beginning. Stalin was completely taken by surprise, even though he had been warned about the imminent attack by many spies within Nazi Germany who were working for the Soviets. The Soviets had an unbelievably effective spy network. A name to learn is Richard Sorge. He was a German diplomat in the Tokyo embassy. He was in reading the secret German messages, encryptions, and he passed that on to the Soviet leadership months before Barbarossa. The warning that Germany was going to attack, Stalin accused him of trying to stir the pot and dismissed his information. So when Barbarossa hit, the Red Army was utterly unprepared and were swept back by rapid German movements. Key cities like Kiev and Minsk were taken. Nobody could believe how quickly they were taken. Whole Soviet armies, literally of hundreds of thousands of men, were lost in these giant encirclements where the German panzers were able to just surround them and then cut them off in a pincer movement. But in Barbarossa, there were key targets, Moscow and Leningrad. neither Moscow nor Leningrad were taken in that first push. And really, the fact that the Soviets managed to hang on in those first 6 months, that turned the war. By 1942-43, the Soviet Union under Marshal Zhukov, who became general but became Marshal Zhukov, won the Battle of Stalingrad. Nikita Khrushchev, who was a leading member of the Communist Party and later the leader of the Soviet Union, played a very important role at Stalingrad. He also played a very important role at Kursk, which was really, if Stalingrad was the turning point of the war, Kursk was the moment when Germany really could not win the war. The war was a defensive war from that point forward. It was the biggest tank battle of the war, and it was won by the Red Army. And of course, in 1945, the Red Army took Berlin, and the Soviet Union was the dominant force in Eastern Europe. 27 million citizens of the Soviet Union died in the Second World War in less than 4 years. Incredible, isn't it? 27 million people. But by the end of it, Stalin was more powerful than he had ever been. Even people like Zhukov, who was a hero of the Soviet army, nobody was a threat to Stalin. He was the head of a country that had 11 million men and women under arms, and a country that had gone from, in the late 1920s, a very, very, very underdeveloped and weak nation to one of the two world superpowers by 1945. So that's a good overview of Stalinist Russia. Marry that to the other video that is already up, and you should have what you need for whatever they ask you on it, if they ask you on it. Okay, good stuff.